very unique. So what we want to do tonight, again, is just give you some food for thought, talk about a number of issues that we want to keep our eye on as we work little by little through this great Gospel of John. So obviously, a good place to start would be to talk about who's the author of this gospel that we call John, and when was it written? So Shell's going to kick us off tonight. She's going to talk a little bit about authorship. She's going to talk about a good date, maybe, for the Gospel of John.
Okay. When we read through the chapters here in the Gospel of John, we see that the fourth Gospel never actually names its author. The author only identifies himself as the beloved disciple. He calls himself the beloved disciple. And we need to be aware that there are many opinions as to the authorship of the fourth gospel. A recent scholarly survey stated that there are 23 candidates for authorship for this book. And that is a lot of differing opinions on who wrote this gospel. But with one exception only. Every piece of ancient evidence that we have says that it was John, the disciple of Jesus and brother of the fellow disciple James. They were the sons of Zebedee, and Jesus nicknamed them the sons of thunder. And the synoptics will tell us, synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that Peter, James, and John were in the inner circle of Jesus. Yet, James and John are not mentioned by name in the fourth gospel. But Peter is all throughout. But they are only referred to as the sons of Zebedee once in the closing chapter. So though the author is unnamed, we do know that according to chapter 21, he was an eyewitness of Jesus. He is testifying to the things that he has seen in this book. And he begins this gospel in chapter 1, verse 14 by saying, "We saw his glory." Talking about Jesus. And so he is an eyewitness of Jesus, and he is telling us about what he has seen. The author also has great knowledge of the land of Israel, and he devotes more time than the synoptic gospels to events that occur in Judea and Jerusalem. He speaks of specific places in the land of Israel that have been unearthed in archaeological finds today, like the pools of Siloam, the pools of Bethesda. He talks about Jacob's well in different places. He also uses an abundance of references to the Hebrew scripture, so he's very familiar with the Hebrew Bible. And so the traditional view is that the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee and brother of fellow disciple James. It's also generally held that his mother's name is Salome. We read about Salome in Mark chapter 15, verse 40. And it talks about the women that came from the Galilee with Jesus down to Jerusalem. And she was there and witnessed the crucifixion. We also believe this is the same person mentioned in Matthew chapter 27, verse 56, where this woman is listed as the mother of Zebedee's sons. And many people believe that this is the same woman as Jesus' mother's sister that we read about here in the Gospel of John in John 19:25. A lot of people think that these three mentions are one and the same person. And so if so, John is related to Jesus through Mary. Now, we want to make sure that we don't confuse John with John the Baptist or John the father of Peter. They are not the same people. John the Baptist did not pen this, but John the disciple did. And it also is very, very likely, and we hold the traditional view, that the same author of the Gospel of John also is responsible for 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John that we read about in the New Testament. And also the traditional view is that John is our same John the Revelator who penned down the book of Revelation. What we want to note as we close on authorship is that as early as the end of the 2nd century AD, which is very early church fathers are on record attributing this gospel to John, the disciple of Jesus. And one of those early sources is the church father Irenaeus. and he speaks of John's authorship several times. He specifically said that John was the one that leaned on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, and that he wrote a gospel when he lived in Ephesus. And so other ancient sources also attribute this gospel to John. And by the 4th century, it was widely accepted that John the disciple was, in fact, the author of the 4th gospel. In fact, when we look at church history, no Orthodox Christian writer gives an alternative. They don't give another option to the authorship of John. So it's a very strong tradition that John wrote this gospel. So we hold to the traditional view that John is the author of the 4th gospel. And there is also a lot of debate among scholars as to when exactly was this gospel penned down. What is the date of its writing? Some would date it as early as 40 AD, just a few years after the resurrection of Jesus and ascension to heaven, and some as late as 110 AD. Most conservative scholars, we feel that it is written between 80 and 90 AD. There's a number of reasons why it appears it was written between 80 and 90. But a good example is the earliest New Testament manuscript that we have contains a portion of John's gospel. So Dan, talk to us about this papyrus.
Sure, it's a fascinating little papyrus, and we've actually got some images. What we've got is a early manuscript, and you're looking at it here. You've got on the left-hand side, this is the front side, and then over to the bottom right is the back side, the flip side, that, again, is just simply called the verso, the back side. And we've got a little portion here of John chapter 18. Now, again, as Michelle said, this is the earliest New Testament manuscript known to exist. This could be as early as 100 AD. Most would date it about 130 AD. Now, that's very early, okay? And it shows up, it's discovered down in Egypt. Have you heard of Egypt before? Know the place with the pyramids, right? We good? We know where Egypt is. Well, down in Egypt, this little tiny manuscript and some others along with it were discovered there. And again, this tells us that by 130 AD, the Gospel of John has already in circulation in Egypt, and it's already being copied. So, do you see our line of thinking? If it's already being copied at 130, you're going to be hard-pressed to be dating the Gospel of John much later than 80 to 90 AD. So there are some that would argue for a much later date of John and say, no, it couldn't really be the beloved disciple John, and they come up with a lot of different reasons. But we've got some great evidence here that the Gospel of John was spreading all the way down in Egypt, again, as early as 130 AD. And again, it contains John chapter 18, verse 31 through 33. Now, you just get just a little portion of it. Now, in case you didn't know, that is in Greek, and it's on papyrus. That's the material that it's written on. So again, when we're talking about a date, let's think of a date, if you want to write it down, between 80 to 90. And again, this is known as P52, okay? Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of the distinctive features that we find when we look at the Gospel of John. Now, how many Gospels do we have in our biblical text? That's right, 4. Everybody say 4. Say it again, 4. Yeah, we've got Matthew, we've got Mark, we've got Luke, and obviously we've got John. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we refer to them as the synoptic Gospels. You've heard us use that term before, the synoptic Gospels. All that means is you can view them side by side. Those of you that aren't strangers to the New Testament Gospels, you know that when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a lot of overlap, isn't there? There's a lot of sharing of the same stories. There's some differences along the way, right? We call those variations, and variations are a good thing, right? But when we come to John, John is very, very different than the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Who's noticed that before? Just wave at me. Yeah, you've read it. You know it's very, very different. You may want to write this down. We've said it when we were promoting the series, 92%. Okay, 92% of the Gospel of John is unique when we compare it with the other Gospels. How many know if you get 92 on a test, you're shouting glory? Everybody happy about a 92? 92 is good. 92% of what we read about in John is unique to John, meaning only 8%. Again, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but 100 minus 92 equals 8. Only 8% okay, overlap between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Pretty shocking, would you agree? Okay, so again, a lot of very, very unique material that we find in the Gospel of John. So really, we've got to start off our series tonight with two big questions. Everybody say two big questions. Yeah, two big questions. Number one, why is John so different? Okay, why is John so different? We've already given the stat, 92% unique to John. So why is he so different from the synoptics? And then number two, does John know about the synoptics? Does he know about Matthew? Does he know about Mark? And does he know about Luke? Or does he not? Now, really, when we look at the Gospel of John, and again, we're going to take a close look at it, it becomes really clear that John was familiar with many, if not all, of the Gospels that led up to his Gospel. Okay? If you look at John as a whole, you find that really John chooses to almost write a supplement to the other Gospels. You know what a supplement is? I mean, think of it this way. Let's break it down this way. John knows about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We've talked about all the overlap, all the common stories that are shared. In John, if it is indeed John, we're holding to that traditional view, who was one of the inner three that was privy to some things that other disciples weren't, it shouldn't shock us that John is going to contain a lot of material that's unique to John as an eyewitness, as one of the inner three. Does that make sense? So it's not that John doesn't know about the other Gospels. It's John most likely does, in fact, know about them, but he wants to bring some new information to the table. How do you know new information's good? Can you imagine us not having the Gospel of John? Can't even imagine it, can you? So much of what we know about the life and ministry of Jesus, we think John. We think of all those great stories that are unique to him. So most likely it appears that John didn't want to repeat any of these other accounts. And in fact, if we look at, again, the Gospel of John, it seems like the author assumes that his readers are already very well familiar with those well-known stories or the basic core teachings of Jesus and the main life events of Jesus. And Shell's going to take just a couple seconds and give us just a few little examples that really point this out.
Yes, it's like he's taking for granted that we are already familiar with these things. In John chapter 3, verse 24, he's speaking about an event, and he says, before John was put in prison, yet the Gospel of John never tells us later on that John the Baptist was put in prison. He's assuming, of course, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that we already know that information. He's assuming that we're familiar with that story, that his audience was familiar. He introduces people without explanations, as if we already know them. John the Baptist, Peter, the 12 disciples, Judas, Pilate. So things like that he takes for granted that the audience is already familiar with. And another unique feature is that John highlights more of Jesus' ministry in Judea, mainly in Jerusalem. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus conducts 80% of his ministry up in the Galilee, in that area where his hometown, of course, Nazareth, and then he moved his hometown headquarters to Capernaum. Most of his ministry is in the Galilee. And the Synoptic Gospels, of course, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, they save any mention of the adult Jesus coming to Jerusalem until that final week of Jesus' life, right before his arrest and his crucifixion and his resurrection. You don't read about the adult Jesus in Jerusalem in the Synoptic Gospels outside of the Passion narratives. But in John, we have the fuller picture of Jesus going back and forth to Jerusalem, attending the feasts, as the Jewish males were required to go and attend the feasts in Jerusalem. He's going back and forth to Jerusalem. He attends several Passovers. He attends another feast in Jerusalem that they don't name. He attends the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Hanukkah. We have more of his accounts of interactions of Jesus with the people of Judea in the Gospel of John, that fuller picture of his ministry there in Jerusalem. And so, Dan, tell us about some of the other variations there with the synoptics.
Now, another notable difference we want to just mention tonight, if you're taking notes, again, we're comparing John with the synoptics. So what are the synoptics again? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, one of the variations, or one of the notable differences, let's say, is the way that John presents the teaching of Jesus. Now, think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke for a minute. How many of you are familiar with what a parable is? Okay, we've done courses we've done illustrated parables in here. I mean, it's like parable on every page in the synoptics, isn't it? Especially Matthew. Sometimes we've got these long, long parables that Jesus is giving to really illustrate a point. We know the pattern. Jesus, like other teachers of his day, would teach on something, and then to drive the point home, he'd give a good illustration. Preachers still do that today. How do you know that? So he's going to use these parables so his people can really grasp the really essentials of the teaching that he's giving. Now, we find parables all over the place in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But when it comes to John, guess what? Zip. We don't have any parable that is remotely like Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Gospel of John. So when John presents the main teaching of Jesus, we've got these long discourses. How many of you know what I'm talking about? We don't have to wait long for that to happen either, do we? John chapter 3. Do you remember John chapter 3? Jesus meets with a very well-known religious man by the name of Nicodemus. Everybody say Nicodemus. Yeah, we don't hear that name every day, but it was pretty common, best we can tell, in Jesus' day. But Nicodemus has a very lengthy conversation with Jesus, and it's long. Look at it. There's a lot. If you've got a red letter edition, buddy, you got a lot of red going on, don't you? Okay, so go and look at it later. Well, we don't have much like that when it comes to the Synoptic Gospels. Now, when you think of Matthew, let's go to Matthew again. Remember the Sermon on the Mount? Who remembers the Sermon on the Mount? All right, we've got Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. We did a series in here on Wednesday night, you may recall. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. When you turn the pages, do this later, not now, it's all red. Red, 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 red. And so maybe you're thinking, oh, well, what about that passage? You know, we've got a lot of red and 3 chapters there. But again, remember, Matthew is collecting material that Jesus probably spoke over a period of several days, and he's combining it together and just providing it in one nice little concise account in his gospel, okay? So yes, it's a lengthy conversation of Jesus, but it's a conversation that took place over many days, okay? But in the Gospel of John, again, we've got these long discourses like chapter number 3. Let me give you another example. John chapter 6. Remember, Jesus is saying, I'm the bread of life. Okay? Go and look at John chapter 6 later, because it's going to be a while before we get there, and you'll find it's a lengthy, lengthy discussion of Jesus. And then finally, the last example that I want to just leave you with is John chapter 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. All those chapters, if you've got a red letter edition, guess what? You've got a lot of red going on. And this is Jesus giving this great teaching material at what we call the Lord's Supper, okay? Or the Last Supper. We don't have any of that material in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, do we? So that's unique to John. So again, the way John even presents the teaching of Jesus is very different than what we have in the Synoptic Gospels. So we just wanted to mention those things. Now, another really important thing we want to mention is a lot of the details that are really, really important in our Synoptic Gospels. We call it triple tradition. Everybody say triple tradition. Say it again, triple tradition. That's a story that's shared in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? It's shared in each one. We call it triple tradition. Those are those passages that are so important that under the direction of the Holy Spirit, each of the gospel writers penned down for us. That's that overlap we were talking about. Well, a lot of that information that's so important for them, guess what? When it comes to John, they don't appear anywhere. Let me give you just a couple of examples. There are many, and we'll highlight them as we go. First of all, John doesn't mention that Jesus gets baptized by John the Baptist. How many know that's a pretty important detail? You remember in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what happens? Jesus goes to John, he's baptized, and then we've got a heavenly voice, right? This is my Son, the beloved. Hear him. You remember God saying that from the heavens? Guess what? Not there in the Gospel of John, okay? Next, John doesn't even record Jesus' time of testing and temptation in the wilderness. Remember how important that is for Matthew, Mark, and Luke? before Jesus even begins his public ministry, he's got to go out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. He's going to be tested by God, and he's going to be tempted by Satan. Guess what? John doesn't even mention it. And then also, John doesn't, as we said, include any of the parables as we know them from the synoptics. They're absent. Also, remember the way that the synoptic gospels close out the public ministry of Jesus is with something that we call the transfiguration. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say the transfiguration? Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, our John, goes up to a high mountain, we're not sure which one, and while he's there, he's transfigured before them, and two pretty important people come and have a discussion with Jesus. Do you remember who they were? Yeah, Moses and Elijah. And you remember that great story. We've got another voice from heaven. It's the same voice, and it declares basically the same thing it did at the baptism of Jesus in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is my son, the beloved. In him I'm well pleased. Okay, it's that same basic declaration. Again, so important in the synoptics, just not found in John. And then the last thing we just want to mention that is very interesting is that, remember, in Matthew and Mark especially, we find some really precise details that Jesus gives at the Lord's Supper, okay, his Last Supper. He institutes what we call communion. Everybody know what communion is? If you were here Sunday night, we observed communion together. Remember, Jesus gives specific instruction. From now on, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. Take this bread, take this cup. We all know what communion is. We don't have any specific instructions about communion in the Gospel of John. Now, we've just mentioned a few things. How many of you think they're pretty major things to leave out? Okay? Now, again, remember, it's not that John doesn't know about all those things. He does. But remember, space was very precious in antiquity. Okay? Most of us today, when we're going to write something out, we're going to do it in a word processor, aren't we? You know what I'm talking about? Word or whatever your flavor is that you use, okay? And you're not so much worried about space when you sit down and you're writing. But, in antiquity, yeah, you had to always keep a careful eye on your space. So the reason John leaves out so much is because he brings so much new to the table. Does that make sense? Absolutely. Okay. So again, we just wanted to take time to talk about that, okay? So Shell, why don't you go ahead and tell us about another distinctive feature of John?
Yes, we wanted to say a word about a group of people that receive a lot of attention in the Gospel of John. 59 times we read about the Jews in the Gospel of John, and it is mentioned in a variety of ways, the Jews. And so this is very important when we're reading the Gospel of John, that we need to be aware that because of some Christian misunderstanding of the terminology, the Jews, in various commentaries, books, and teachings, many Jews today, unfortunately feel that the book of John is somehow anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. Of course, we know it is not, but we need to talk about it because it is important. We know that Jesus himself was fully Jewish, and so were his disciples. So was the early church. Every New Testament book was written by a Jew with the exception of Luke. So obviously Jesus is not anti-Jewish. Just to give a couple of examples of what we're talking about here and how there could be misunderstanding, I want to just give a few examples of the 59 references to the Jews in John. In one place he says, "For salvation is of the Jews." In another place, it says, Jesus did not wish to go about in Judea because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. In another place, it says, then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him. And then it goes on. And in another place, Jesus says to his disciples, little children, I am only with you a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you. Now, we know that his disciples were Jews. So what is meant when we see this phrase, the Jews? Clearly the phrase, the Jews, in John does not have only one meaning. As I said, there are 59 references. Many times it is indeed just the general, the Jews being the Jewish people. Other times, like the verse when he speaks of his disciples, it has a more narrow meaning to more specific Jews. Many other times we should take this to mean the Jewish leaders, and that occurs many, many times when it's talking about the Jews. It's talking about the leadership. We know that Jesus was popular with the people, but he did have frequent confrontations with the leadership. He was always prodding them on to righteousness. On the surface level, some of Jesus' stern warnings to the leadership could lead you to think, if you were just reading at the surface level, that he's against them. But Jesus is not against the Jews or the Jewish faith. We have to keep his words in their proper context. Jesus debates the leaders on key issues, of course, but it's always an in-house, a brotherly conversation, we might say. And other times, and a lot of times, the Jews clearly means people from Judea. There was a religious tension between the people from the north and the people from the center of the country, from the Galileans and from those who dwelt in Jerusalem, or the Judeans. And so John makes the distinction between those Jews from the Galilee and those Jews from Judea. So the context, when we're reading this gospel, we just need to put it in context of who exactly is being referred to when we see the Jews, because it doesn't always mean just one thing. And we also wanted to mention that the Gospel of John, and sometimes when you're reading various books, a lot of times people will talk about this book as having a lot of Greek influence, or it's immersed in Greek culture, or it's the gospel with the greatest appeal to Greek thinkers, putting it as opposed to the gospel with Jewish background. But when we read this gospel, we see that it is the most, or one of the most Jewish-centric gospel of all four Gospels. It's careful to present Jesus as an observant Jew, as the fulfillment of the promised Jewish Messiah. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is attending more feasts and holidays in Jerusalem than in the synoptic Gospels. And Jerusalem plays that frequent role in this Gospel. We see the temple mentioned all the time. We see Jewish customs being explained. We see imagery, Jewish imagery, brought to the forefront here in the fourth Gospel. So in no way does the author try to distance Jesus from his Jewish roots. He doesn't try to do that. In fact, he brings it out very, very clearly that this gospel is a Jewish book. So